Good morning, everyone. We are here today to talk about the jazz scene and blues scene as they pertain to the specific region of Chicago. Today is actually also our last lecture of the semester and also concludes our discussion of music of the North. I want to make sure to tie together a number of common themes that we have seen through a number of different musical traditions and emergences of genres during this lecture as is possible in really trying to focus our discussion on Chicago. As always, I have prepared some lecture notes for today, which I will go ahead and share with you. So I want to introduce our topic by first discussing Chicago jazz. And Chicago jazz emerged and evolved along a similar timeline as Chicago blues, which is why we're going to be discussing both of those genres during today's lecture. And that was really during the early to mid 20th century. So we're going to be concentrating our discussion from 1900 to about 1950. Its artists, both within blues and jazz, inspired a new generation of music. They were both really seminal in creating genres like modern rock, pop, alternative music. They really do all have their roots in Chicago jazz and blues and owe a lot to its founders that were prominent artists within this genre. So today's lecture is going to outline some of the key players, locations, and historical motivations behind the jazz movement and blues movement as they pertain to Chicago in particular. We're going to start our discussion talking about the upper left-hand side here. This idea of migration and movement, and that's something that's been an ongoing theme in a number of our discussions. So after the turn of the century, a movement of 6 million African Americans relocated from the southern states to the East, West, and Midwest. And this movement of people became known as the Great Migration, and it covers a large period of history from 1916 to 1970, and arguably is still something that is in play. And our first video is going to discuss that very idea that the Great Migration is something that is perhaps still ongoing, even though we perhaps have put a small pause in it in 1970. It's the migration of African Americans is huge within this particular movement, and why it's had a continuation, especially recently, is worth investigation. But in any case, the first part of the movement, people were initially drawn to Chicago for its wealthy, for three main reasons. So it had wealthy manufacturing, railroad, and meat packing industries. So three major economic powerhouses that are going to be doing business in Chicago. And so the move really included also the expansion of popular music and styles, bringing jazz to Chicago and the rest of the country. Initially we have jazz starting out in small local clubs on the South Side, but before we even get to the story of jazz, I want to talk about the predecessors, the two main contributing lines of jazz and blues that feed up into the Chicago style through the Great Migration. So let me go ahead and pull up the first video for today.
This map shows the Black Belt of the United States. Its name comes from the fertile soil associated with the region. And for most of America's history, more than 90% of the country's largest minority group lived here. Starting in the early 20th century, nearly half of the African American population left this region to resettle in emerging northern and midwestern cities. It was one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history, and now data indicates that a new movement is taking shape. To understand why, let's go back to 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery and started a new era for colored people in the states. Shortly after, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enfranchised people of color at large. For the first time, the majority of Black Americans controlled their own destinies. In the years immediately following emancipation, most freed slaves chose to stay in their communities. After all, the only America they had known was the South. It was common for their descendants to work as sharecroppers on plantations. Sometimes their only payment was permission to live on the property. But that wasn't the worst aspect of the South for Blacks.
The Jim Crow caste system determined where you could eat, what platform you stood on when you were catching a train. This was a rigid caste system in which any breach of the caste system could literally mean your life.
That's author and journalist Isabel Wilkerson. She spent 15 years compiling the stories of Black exodus to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. The movement would come to be known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was really a seeking of political asylum within the borders of our own country. Many of them were fleeing for their lives. They were fleeing a caste system, a rigid caste system known as Jim Crow, in which everything that you could and could not do was based on what you looked like.
In 1915, African Americans began to leave the Black Belt for these new industrial centers. By 1929, 1.5 million African Americans had resettled in new northern metro areas. At the time, America's participation in World War I drove demand for manufacturing labor. But strict immigration laws left northern factories with a shortage of workers. Factories in the north started recruiting low-skilled workers from the south. The workers faced discrimination in their new homes, which culminated in the Red Summer of 1919. Migrant Blacks, whites, and European immigrants were all competing for limited housing and resources, which exacerbated relationships in city centers. The most prominent of these settlements for migrating Blacks was New York City, and the art, music, and theater that emerged from this community became known as the Harlem Renaissance. These artistic achievements redefined the cultural image of Blacks in America. But the stock market crash of 1929 and ensuing Great Depression slowed the influx from the South and effectively ended the first migration. A second wave began in the 40s, when World War II kick-started manufacturing again, while agricultural employment in the South plummeted. Once again, people living in the rural South began to migrate to cities. Manufacturing hubs in the West were far more prominent in this second movement, but only a fraction of skilled labor positions went to African Americans. That kind of discrimination was a common experience for participants in the Great Migration. Throughout history, the segregated neighborhoods that Southern Blacks flocked to often became the ground centers of massive, racially motivated rioting. In most cases, the protesting began in response to perceived unfair treatment of the Black community. This is a trend that continues today, as seen in modern violent protests in Baltimore, Ferguson, and Milwaukee. By the end of the second migration, an estimated 5 to 8 million Blacks had resettled outside of the South. Moving ahead to the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement had introduced a new vision of racial identity in America. This movement's leaders argued for the equality of all people. Meanwhile, the definition of all people was changing. Changes in immigration policy starting in 1952 started a new era of skills-based multicultural immigration. This includes African migrants adding a new Black perspective to the American story. By the 1990s, a new multicultural American identity had emerged. During this period, the rise of the Black middle class was evident.
You know, we're used to thinking about white flight to the suburbs and Black segregation, Black concentration in cities.
That's the voice of William Fry. He's been tracking the shifting demographics of America over the past 5 decades.
To some degree that still exists, but there's also been a noticeable movement of Blacks to the suburbs, and it's fairly pervasive. It's not just in 2 or 3 cities, but it's in a lot of cities across the country. Northern cities, southern cities, western cities. African Americans started to make this move, especially in the last 20 or 25 years. Really large numbers of Blacks moved to the South. I attribute some of it to younger generations, several generations since the civil rights laws were enacted in the 1960s, who now do have an opportunity to get advanced educations, at least some college, and, you know, getting that foothold into the middle class, I think, is an important part of what's going on.
Today, the geography established by the Great Migration is beginning to fade away. Southern states have been leaders in Black population growth since the 1970s. Still, these states have only captured a 4% increase in the share of the Black population over the last 4 decades. So while we are seeing a reversal of the trend of African American migration to cities, it's unlikely the movement will be as far-reaching as the great migrations of the past. And it's because this migration is about a search for agency and opportunity, not about fleeing from violence.
The stakes are not the same now as they would have been during the Great Migration. They are quite different in character and in magnitude. Many of them were fleeing like refugees with no certainty as to what was going to happen to them or how they would make a go of it in this new alien land. That was a watershed moment in American history, and like watershed moments, it's not something that is easily duplicated.
So I like this video in particular because it talks about a number of regions that we have investigated throughout the semester. New York being one of them, Detroit being one that we, again, just recently did some, lecture work on, and now Chicago. And we've seen this pattern time and time again, that the movement of people is going to be a major player and a huge participant in driving the direction of what happens with culture and also music. In regards to music in particular, we have two root genres that are within the greater umbrella of jazz that make their way up to Chicago. Before we talk about that, I want to talk about the and integrated into that topic, talking about the Great Migration as it corresponds directly to music. As you are all aware, New York has a number of very important institutions and performing centers for music, Carnegie Hall being one of them, and Lincoln Center being another. In any case, we have a couple of videos that I'm going to play from both of those institutes that have really some wonderful perspectives from other scholars that study these things perhaps more in depth than I do. My areas of interest are in slightly different topics. However interesting this is, I do want you to hear some experts within the field itself.
There is nothing neutral about the movement of people. There's nothing apolitical about the creation of music.
The United States is a conglomeration of massive waves of history.
Well, any traditional music is part of a continuing stream of consciousness. And if it's a product of migration, it would have a lot of meaning suffused in it.
The important thing is to connect the dots, to look at our history, which is a cultural history unlike any other nation.
What reflecting on migration does, it requires us to sit in the fullness of the pain of that experience in order to really appreciate the beautiful things that emerge from it. I think the reason why so many jazz musicians have roots to the Southern experience is that that is where I think a truly organic Black cultural form developed. In the moment of the Great Migration, people knew they were doing something that was unprecedented because there had been such restriction on African American mobility for such a long time after the end of slavery. They had to be really aware that something was shifting in the country.
Part of leaving the South was the terror that was created in the South. The terror of oppression, the terror of violence, and what that does for generations. People trying to escape for generations. And here's a moment where millions of people decide enough is enough, and I have enough to get out.
When you think about all of the musical potential that was unleashed when people had the opportunity to leave the South, commercialize their work, and popularize their work, whether it's Mahalia Jackson coming to Chicago and revolutionizing gospel music, the influence of Berry Gordy and Motown.
You have a jazz musician is moving up from Kansas City, coming up to New York, sharing the music. The blues taking the boat up the Delta, finding its way to Detroit, Motown bursting.
For people who had been so constrained in their everyday life, people were remaking their identities during the Great Migration.
But the thing they never believed behind is the sound they heard from where they were from. It never escapes it. The way Thelonious Monk plays, he never escapes the slur of the slang of North Carolina. That's what he plays when he's playing two notes right next to each other.
It's impossible to treat the migration as an isolated event, and it's impossible to tell it in the company of the other events. You just have to start talking.
This is how we understand the music we play. We know it's simply not just a piece of music that we set up here and then we play it and it's that simple. But that all those layers behind it for us are the things that we have to continue to bring to the front.
Migration history isn't just about the history of one community moving into a new area. It's about how newcomers confront each other and what they sound like to each other.
And I think we've only begun to explore the surface of the connections that happen when we all end up here together.
The only reason America exists in the way that it does is because of the contributions of every culture from around the planet.
I think that these migrations remind us that there are many American stories, and there is nothing that requires our attention and our care more than ensuring that we are always striving to tell the fullest and most complicated story about our nation.
So Carnegie Hall presented this as a festival topic, but I thought that it offered some interesting perspective from some individuals as to, right, kind of some of the musical products of the Great Migration, which are far-reaching. Going back to my lecture notes, there we go. I want to just sort of lay the groundwork for what we're going to really talk about in part two, which is which are the two main genres of jazz that came with the people who participated in the Great Migration. So we have Dixieland jazz and Mississippi Delta jazz, or otherwise known as Delta blues, becoming really the basis of Chicago jazz and Chicago blues, which are going to dominate the sound of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So to start though, we're going to begin our story more turn of the century, 1900s, and talk about Dixieland jazz and Mississippi Delta jazz in detail. One started in New Orleans, the other one, of course, in Mississippi, and they have actually wonderfully contrasting features for both being within the larger umbrella of jazz. So looking forward to unpacking both of those with you in part two. In part three, we'll talk about Chicago blues first, and then in part four, we'll talk about Chicago jazz. So see you back for part two shortly.